So I think that there are things that have gone wrong. There's certainly things that have gone wrong in England, otherwise we wouldn't need to be having a seminar about working with whole families. Most of us live in families of one sort or another, or live amongst families or are cognizant of our families even when we're not with them. But somehow this has become eroded. And I think one of the reasons why this has become eroded is because of an excessive focus on a particular version of child welfare as somehow separate from the family. So what went wrong? Well, it's obvious why the system focuses on children. And we've got Marion Brandon here, who's done lots of work on looking at the persistent errors that happen in professional practice with children. And they are persistent, and they carry on, and they carry on, and they carry on. But each time they happen, the system focuses on them and tries to fix them in particular kinds of ways. These are international problems. Children die all over the place in similar circumstances. And the professional failures are ubiquitous. But in our attempts to try and manage those failures, there have been particular versions of control of professional practice which have come to settle in profoundly damaging ways. So one of the reasons why this happens is that social work, I should have changed this slide, family welfare, family policy takes place in the context of blame. So when something happens, there's a lot of political pressure to do something. And there are lots of people who will line up to tell politicians that they have a solution, that this is going to sort the problem out. The problem remains the problem that we've just talked about, that there are some very high-profile cases which have typical and atypical aspects to them, but which drive these political solutions in particular kinds of ways. We've got another moral agenda going on, I think, and I'll talk about the UK, but I don't think it is just in the UK, which is about the way families ought to behave. So, strong but wrong solutions. I'm so sick of this slide because this is the diagram for the piece of software which was designed to drive practice in children's social care in the UK. And the reason why I'm so sick of it is that we first started criticising this system 2008, and with barely any softening, it is still in place. Now, what this does is attempt to break down the task of assessing families into discrete tasks and to embed these in a computer system so that people working with families have no choice but to follow this rigid so-called workflow. Now, this is taken from business processes, and in fact some of the software systems that are in use in children's social care have come from banking and a variety of other domains. In fact, in one that is present in many local authorities, the family is called a business user, not a family. So, I rest my case. Some of them are better designed than others, but this was actually centrally designed by mainly civil servants, hardly any input from practice. Now, what this does to the human brain, more brains later, but what this does to our brains when we're working in it is it concentrates our mind on the arrows between those nice geometric shapes. So we've got new verbs that have arisen in English. I've outcomed it, I've workflowed it. And these, of course, are at best semi-detached from the real work that is going on with families, which is actually very squeezed because people are preoccupied with this. Now, in these shapes, there are things like decide whether you need an emergency protection order, decide whether you need to remove a child. Now, that is not a square, that decision. It is a great big smelly throbbing blob of something. It is something very scary. And this it massages all that away. So actually, it should look like this. So if you're going to have an IT system to support practice, then it really needs to be prompting you that you're doing something very consequential at the moment, and perhaps you should be having a conversation with somebody about it. This actually forces people to make decisions quickly. And this is being exported. We've got Briege and Dave and I did a paper about the Irish context, and this is just a tiny little bit of the workflow that is being exported to Ireland. I had I've had various bits of correspondence from various jurisdictions over the years, but last week I heard that this was being exported to Denmark and the Netherlands. Why is this being exported to Denmark and the Netherlands when there is a very well-established critique that this didn't work in the UK? Some of our delightful ambassadors are going around selling this to other jurisdictions. So this is really problematic, and it is coming to a country near you. I mean, I wouldn't be at all surprised if it doesn't pop. Well, it's not going to pop up in Chile because Dave is going to stop it from happening. But so that's one thing. This preoccupation with exporting processes that are focused on efficiency, not safety, from the wrong domains. And I always use the example of making Guinness. I don't know why I came up with it. I think it was probably in Dublin at the time. But if you're trying to make pints of beer, you want them all to be the same. You want every pint of beer to be the same. So sorting out your processes so that everybody does the same thing at the same time makes sense. If you're trying to make sense of complicated family situations, it does not. Now, Dave corrected me about beer and said, no, you don't actually even have to do the same thing with beer. You've got to keep checking your blends and making sure that the barley is different each time and so on and so on. But anyway, I'm going to stick with that analogy for now. Now, so that you've got the problem with fixing the system with the wrong pill, and then when the pill doesn't work, increasing the dose. So that's the first problem with the system. The second problem with the system is how you ensure that it is working properly. And again, in the UK, we have an inspectorial framework, which Briege and Kate and I are writing a book at the moment, and we've called it the uranium in the boat, because actually the people are so focused on the people who are going to come and inspect their services, which is a great big throbbing lump of radioactive material. They're so busy looking at that they're not focusing on the work that is going on with children and families. And they can't, because these people sweep in and they make judgments based on counting things that don't count often, and a variety of other things. So if I just read these out, this is from the Birmingham, I think it's the last Ofsted inspection, although there's probably been more since. The overall effectiveness of local authority arrangements for the protection of children is inadequate. In February 2009, the Secretary of State issued an improvement notice to Birmingham City Council due to poor performance in safeguarding children and young people. A further improvement notice, so that one didn't work, note. So we now have a further improvement notice which was issued in September 2010. And during 2011, a major restructure and overhaul of children's services was undertaken with the oversight of the Improvement Board, even though it hasn't worked. Since the first improvement notice, Ofsted has undertaken a safeguarding, and Ofsted is the inspectorate, by the way, and 2 unannounced inspections of the Council's contact, referral and assessment arrangements for children and young people. Concerns with regards to the quality of practice in protecting children have been raised in all 3 inspection reports. Right? So if inspection worked, wouldn't it have worked? So we don't conclude from this that inspection doesn't work, that in fact, even though there's been all this scrutiny, things aren't better. What we conclude is, well, actually, they need some more inspection. So we've got the same reasoning. The wrong pill doesn't work, bigger dose. Now, this has a profound effect on people working in these services, and this is from a friend of mine who's a senior manager in a local authority, and she wrote this to me in an email. This is a previously high-performing authority. Did you hear we became inadequate? We've been in a grief cycle since then. I got a bit of perspective back when my dad died. Ofsted has left us running around like headless chickens. We're now going to rush into a restructure. We've not heard much from Monroe. That's a review of child protection which recommended that these things be softened. I'm fearing that it's going to go into a black hole with Ofsted challenging all the way. I don't feel inadequate, but maybe I am. Now that is profoundly personally affecting for that person, and it has affected their staff. They had a completely stable staff group. People are now leaving. So there is something really wrong with the reasoning process, that you sweep in and you have this fixed group of inspectors who have nothing to lose apart from being seen not to be critical enough. So we need to do something about that. Now, I suspect that those kinds of regimes are in place, often linked to funding perhaps in other parts of the system. So that's the problem with the system. UK-based, yes, but is being exported. But we've got something really troubling going on about the moral context of child welfare and family policy, I should say. And that is the preoccupation with child welfare rather than community and family-based approaches. And this is held in place by a particular set of ideas. And politicians, and it's not just politicians, as we shall see in a minute, are very good at searching around for evidence to support a moral agenda. Because evidence, as this quotation from Trish Greenhalgh, who's a medic, says, is not just sitting there ready to be harvested, it's created through people's conversations. People can shop around for evidence and package evidence in particular kinds of ways. And this is affected by lobbying, campaigning and interpersonal influencing, and we all try and do that interpersonal influencing, but some of us seem to be more effective than others. So, at the moment, we've got a particular version of evidence, and I know Christine is going to talk about the Washington Consensus in Latin America in a minute, which has got some very similar features to this. Now, we have something newly established called the Early Intervention Foundation in the UK. We don't have any money, but apparently we can afford the Early Intervention Foundation. And this has particularly rigid criteria for the sorts of things that are eligible for funding. So at the top of this, we've got, has the programme been evaluated by at least one randomised controlled trial or two quasi-experimental design methods? So there is not very much of ours that is homegrown that conforms to that. Now, Graham Allen, who's an MP who authored a report on this, has a curious relationship to evidence. He uses an example of what's it called, the Nottingham Good something or other. The Nottingham.
We became an early intervention city, didn't we?
Anyway, there's some sort of initiative in Nottingham, and Graham Allen actually says in his report, well, this has been positively evaluated. You know, people say it's really helpful, but actually it's not, because it hasn't been evaluated by a randomised controlled trial. And actually, if they really want to keep their funding, then they need to do a randomised controlled trial. Now, the problem with that is, in order to make the randomised control methodology work, you would have to do profound violence to the intervention that is taking place in the Nottingham, whatever it is, Futures, Brighter Futures or something it's called. You would have to turn it into chunks of intervention that are separable somehow from the medium of delivery. So it has consequences for the way services are organised as well as the way services are funded. So we've got a moral project. I think this is actually taken from a paper that Breege and Kate and I wrote recently. So we've got a project that's future orientated. You know, we've got to sort these people out. And it's got a kind of underclass overtone. We've got to do something about these recalcitrant poor people. It's got a eugenics overtone, except it's kind of eugenics without the genes. It's got a very unforgiving approach to timescales and change. It's very change orientated. You can't just struggle forever and need a bit of help. You've got to be transformed into some other kind of thing. And it is shored up, this is my current drum, it's shored up by a particular potent neuroscientific argument, which has been widely critiqued from within neuroscience, but is relatively unchallenged in current policy. Indeed, I've had 2 conversations about children's brains already this morning. And so we've got a very narrow version of evidence when it comes to government, but a very poor evaluation of the evidence that exists in this domain. So these are, you can't see these very well, but these are 2 brains, and they are everywhere. If you haven't got these brains in one of your policy documents, they will be coming to you shortly. They are absolutely everywhere, and they are hugely rhetorically potent, because you've got this so-called normal child with a brain here, and then you've got this withered little brain on the right-hand side, which is a child who has been subject to extreme neglect. Now, we have to do a lot of digging around to find out where these brains come from. They originally were used in the work of Bruce Perry, who is a child welfare campaigner from the USA. People are nodding. And when you dig further back, we find out that the child's brain on the right is actually a Romanian orphan, about whom we know nothing about their clinical history. We don't know whether they were born with a small brain. But what we do know is that this child's brain would be small on the outside as well as the inside. This child would have a very small head. Therefore, what are the brain images doing, apart from trying to persuade us that something terribly profound is going on inside children's heads? And this goes on. The Allen report that I just mentioned is full of brains. It's mentioned about 57 times in the first report, the child's brain. Now, in reality, the evidence base about children's neurological development in the context of parenting, I'm not talking about children with pathologies, where clinicians are perfectly reasonably trying to work out the neurobiological mechanisms that affect children's development. Fine. It's still embryonic though, but it's fine that work's going on, and it might well yield some really important evidence, but it is not policy ready at the moment in the domain of parenting. Now, this is a very troubling, very, very troubling document, which is currently being used to train our judiciary in the UK. And the evidence in it, I haven't got time to go into it, but the evidence in it is deeply problematic. It treats evidence that is incredibly unsettled as being completely settled. And we've got a hydra here because I had some correspondence with a very senior neuroscientist, and he said, well done, really good, but in my experience the beast is hydra-headed and it will be very difficult to slay. So this is really, really powerful stuff, and it's also really god-awful poor science. It is really bad. So we've got this apparently is a brain. You know, we've gone from MRI scans to this. This is evidently the brain stem, the midbrain, the limbic system, and the cortex. Apparently, it's actually just a cartoon, is it not? And we now have this graph. This is in the document that I've just mentioned. You'll notice, I have to say that Dave Wastel, who's my partner, has done a lot of this work. Not this work, the analysis of the document. Now, if you notice, this graph is very unusual because it has no y-axis. Now, is this okay? Is this okay to be in a document that is being used to train the judiciary, that we have no y-axis on a graph? And how credulous have our judiciary become that they didn't notice that it had no y-axis? So we also have curious, we assume that this is to do with high, critical periods and so on. But actually, the peak of language development appears to be 1, i.e. before the child can speak, and the peak of cognitive development appears to be 2. So we're all really past it, folks, and, forget higher education because, you've missed your critical period. There's no chance. And then we don't get any explanation for this graph until about several pages later when they talk about windows shutting closed for second language acquisition. Well, again, forget Spanish, Dave. No chance. over 2, done. Now, when you start digging around in this, and here we have the international dimension and the Washington Consensus, what we find is this, the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, which is badged by Harvard University, but is full of the most profoundly dreadful cartoon neuroscience. Now, the report that I've just been talking about, inadvertently, I'm quite sure it was completely unintentional by the authors, have treated the knowledge on this site as being fixed and settled, and it is not. And when we dig further on this, we find that this is actually completely intentional on the part of child welfare campaigners in the USA. And we can see why. They want resources. And we know that this neuroscientific argument is playing well in Australia and has been used to support arguments for early help and early intervention. But it has a dark side, and my God, are we having it in the UK at the moment. Because once you start saying children's brains are finished by the time they're 3, and that if you don't intervene early, they'll end up with a lacunae in their brain and a small brain and irreversible damage caused by elevated levels of cortisol and a large amygdala and poor prefrontal cortex development, you name it, it's all there, this story about development. And it is a story. It's a story. And here we have a paper by Jack Shonkoff, who is one of them, very well-meaning, I'm sure he's a very nice man, and I can't quite work him out because quite a lot of his work is really quite good, and then you get this cartoon stuff. But this is a peer-reviewed paper from February 2011, and he talks in this paper about how he has worked with a PR company for 7 years to package science for appeal to policymakers. And if I just read from this, we'll recognise some of the terms. A working collaboration amongst neuroscientists, developmental psychologists, paediatricians, economists and communications researchers who are engaged in the iterative construction of a core story of development using simplifying models, i.e. metaphors, such as brain architecture, toxic stress and serve and return to explain complex scientific concepts to non-scientists. The aim of this article is to stimulate more systematic empirical approaches to the task of knowledge transfer and underscore the need to view the translation of science into policy and practice as an important academic endeavour in its own right. So he's very proud of this. But unfortunately, what's happened is you've got the translation of a very, very oversimplified, and it's not even oversimplified, it's just bad. And this has been transported completely without question into a highly influential document, and the judiciary are, as we speak, on training courses, being told that this is completely settled knowledge and they must act quickly to remove children. Doesn't mean they will, because they're actually quite bothered about it, so it turns out, but that has been the intention. So, to conclude, this is not a good time to be a family in poverty in England, regardless of the rest of the welfare settlement that's going on, talking about these ideas. And I suspect it's rather similar across the international context, because we have got a very big problem with the dominance of the USA and models that are coming from the USA, and not just the USA, but particularly the USA. So this preoccupation with the early years has an impact on the way people intervene with whole families. It also means that older children really, well, they're stuffed. You know, nobody really cares about older children. And also, it's producing this version. I've only encountered this recently, but it's going to come more and more, that people are now accounting for poor parenting in relation to this irreversible brain damage that said parents are said to have had when they were small children themselves. So you've got this very deterministic, reductionist use of brain damage. So we're getting very little ordinary help. Lots of get the parents to change. We've got this very muscular state paternalism going on in child protection at the moment. So we're getting more and more children pulled into the care system, sometimes explicitly explained using this neuroscience argument. And this is all in the context where the system, back to the flow charts and the outcoming and workflowing, is still broken, and where it's being evaluated from the outside by people who, well, they're definitely not very wise. I'm sure there are a few of them that are quite good, the inspectors, but a lot of them really aren't. And if they were, they would be questioning themselves a little bit more and their own systemic effects on the things that they're measuring. And that's it.